Hey everyone, welcome back to Todos Santos. Today we're going to be continuing on with the port area by making a dockyard. However, I wanted to start by taking care of some of the context that's going to surround this build, and we're starting with this interchange. Now this interchange is in a pretty important spot in that it connects up to a lot of these surface roads that serve the industrial area, that serve the dockyard that we're going to make today, and that are also going to serve a whole nother town that we're going to build along the shoreline at a later point in the series. So I wanted to add a few entry and exit ramps to this interchange from the various roads that pass through this area. So I'm just turning this simple Y interchange into a bit of a mess, a bit of a work of spaghetti, which honestly is a lot of fun. And I like having these kind of weird combinations of ramps and lanes that just, it doesn't make any sense when you look at it from a distance. But if you really get in and look at where the lanes go, it makes sense. And it doesn't allow access to and from any given direction to any other given direction, which is fine. I'm not worried about it being, 100% efficient in that sense. I mostly just wanted to fit in ramps where it was possible without having to go too big in terms of doing a bunch of flyover ramps or tunnels, cloverleaf ramps, that kind of thing. I just wanted to work with the space that I had available. And the design I came up with ended up doing some weird things with the elevation, but we're gonna get to those details later. I wanted to do the dockyard build first, so let's get started on that. Now, a dockyard, also known as a shipyard, is basically a place where you make ships, or repair them. And they can range from gigantic industrial operations that make the largest ships in the world, all the way down to simple, small docks where you can just perform a little bit of maintenance on boats. Now, for this shipyard in Todos Santos, I wanted to go somewhere in between those two, because while there is a pretty stout industrial presence, we have this big cargo port, and we're going to build a few kind of industrial areas around it. That's not really most of what goes on in terms of the economy of Todos Santos. And as far as I understand, for the really, really big ship fabrication yards, you pretty much either need a local place that creates all the materials, the raw materials that you're going to put into these ships, or you need to import a lot of stuff. And I didn't think that Todos Santos really has the capacity for that kind of economic activity. But on the other hand, it is, part of an island nation. So there's going to be a lot of ship traffic. They're going to need repairs and stuff. So I'm imagining that this is the main area for repairing large ships that pass through the vicinity of Todos Santos. But it's not going to be a place for fabricating giant container ships or anything like that. And it's not that I didn't want to do that kind of build, but I just think it didn't really fit the vibe of Todos Santos that I'm going for. Anyway, I found these wonderfully detailed dry dock assets on the workshop. These are by Evangeline. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in checking these out. I just love the texture and the detail on these assets. And I love that they're modular too, which makes it a lot easier to do this kind of build. As I understand it, there are really two main types of dry docks. So this one that we're using here is called a graving dock. And that's basically just a stationary channel in the land in a wharf where you can flood it, send a ship in there, and then drain it, and it'll just sit there and you can work on it. And then there are also floating docks, which are basically mobile docks that float around on the water, and you can set them up around a ship and then work on them from there. I wanted to go with the more traditional graving dock because we have these cool assets, and I think it just looks cool. So as for the flooding, I don't think these assets are really designed to be flooded, but I wanted to set myself the challenge of having one be drained and have a ship in there, which we're going to add later, and then have the other one be flooded. So I basically just used roads to make this happen. I have roads down underneath the flooded dock, and I just lowered those down to kind of force this land to be open so that water could flood in. I also added a water source just to make sure that there was enough water in there. I wasn't sure that the water running in from the ocean would be enough, so I did that. And then on the other one, eventually we're going to put some invisible roads that are raised up above the dry dock, and that just keeps any water from pooling around on there because it'll just run right off the raised invisible roads, and everything looks nice and good. It takes a while to figure that out. I do have flooding in the drained dock occasionally, which is kind of annoying. Pretty much I just kept doing that, and then I would put some vanilla water pumps down to drain all the water out, and then I'd adjust the elevation of the different roads that I talked about until I managed to get it to work. Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I'm not doing a great job of explaining it. So to sum it up, I basically just put roads that aligned with the shape of the dry docks, and for the one I wanted flooded, lower it down to force there to be space for the water to come in, And then on the drain dock, raise the roads up so that all the water runs off. Hopefully that is a little bit better. Probably a time-lapse was not the best way to record this. I wish I had recorded a live segment as I was building it so that I could tell you what I was doing as I was doing it. Unfortunately, it's too late for that. I was so excited about this build. That didn't even cross my mind, and I just did the usual time-lapse. But hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to stop talking about that now because we're moving on to detailing. This is the kind of build, this industrial kind of thing, where after I tried to go for a fairly realistic silhouette or outline and just make it look like a real life sort of thing when you look at it from a distance. After doing that, I just wanted to go crazy with the details because I have absolutely no idea what any of the stuff means. Like when you look at a dry dock on Google Maps, I don't know what any of the markings or containers or anything do for the most part. So I just wanted to make things up as I go. I had this little road that I put together with IMT. It was very similar to the one I made for the cargo port, but I thought it looked weird and out of place. So I wanted to switch it up a little bit, and I decided to turn it into kind of like it almost looks like a box intersection sort of design, which I'm just like in my fantasy world of how dockyards work. Basically says like, don't stop here, just keep driving. You don't want to like stop when all these cranes and heavy machinery and stuff are moving around and doing their thing. So it's just telling you, don't stop. So I took that and copied and pasted that across the entire area. And it's hard to match that up at the intersections when you have a box filler like that, an intersection marking tool. So I just decided to kind of demarcate the intersections with yellow decals just to completely avoid the problem of matching them up in the first place. I kept having this problem with little puddles of water forming on the dry dock. So like I mentioned before, I'm coming in here with some roads and just covering it up and raising it up just the slightest bit to try to keep the water from getting in there in the first place, but then also to drain off any water that does end up there. Yeah, I just had to experiment a little bit, raising it up and down at various heights, and it was pretty challenging, but it's been completely stable since I managed to get the right balance between elevations. And I haven't seen that flooding happen again, so I think we're good in terms of keeping this dry dock actually dry. So of course, we have this drain dock. We have to have a cool looking ship inside of it. This was the best building version of a ship asset that I had. I do have a couple very good looking container ship buildings that are just static and sit there. However, they're filled with containers, which doesn't really make sense for a ship that's undergoing repairs. So I ended up going with this oil tanker, which makes sense. We have a couple places in Todos Santos that will receive oil tankers. So we have one of these that's just chilling out here, getting some repairs done. I also wanted to have some kind of barrier between the roadway here and the work surface and the actual dry dock, because that's a pretty damn steep fall, so you wouldn't want people just rolling off in there. I don't know if that's actually how dry docks work. Maybe there's no barrier there and you're just expected to be really careful. I don't know. But anyway, I wanted to put those down. Probably would have been easier to do it with IMT since I already have the roads running there anyway, but whatever. Sometimes I just revert back to the old ways of doing things by plopping down props one at a time or a group of a few at a time. I also added some cranes because usually on dockyards it seems like you'll have big cranes that run along the side of the dry docks to lift in and out all these big components that you're working with. These cranes were the only ones I had at the time. About halfway through this build, I ventured off to the workshop to find a few more assets that just fit the build a little bit more. So we're going to come back and replace those cranes. And another thing I noticed looking at pictures of various dockyards is that there's a lot of like scaffolding that goes on. So I'm using these, I don't know what they're supposed to be, but they came with the pipeline network and prop pack that I downloaded for the power plant build back in episode, like 32. It was a long time ago. But there are so many like cool looking props that come with that pack, and I've just been using those all over, especially in industrial areas. So I'm just using some of those to represent scaffolding. Now, the edge of the dock here, I imagine, would be a pretty significant place in terms of making sure that workplace safety is in check here. Because you have this area where, at least I assume, you could cross these big barriers when they are up, when the dry dock is closed. So I wanted to add a little bit of a lighting system, or like a stoplight system. It's not functional or anything, but I'm just using some signal light props that came with the tram track pack that I have. So it looks like there would be a light there telling you when you could go or when you had to stop and wait. Anyway, now we're moving back a little bit further away from the water's edge, and I wanted to populate this place with a bunch of kind of random details. Like, apparently for dry docks, you'll usually want to keep quite a bit of material on hand, especially for a smaller dry dock like this, where you're not going to have tons of material going in and out all the time. You keep a little bit of a stock just on hand. And so that's what these warehouses would primarily be for. They might be workshops as well, like for creating some of the smaller bits that go into a ship. But then there will be a lot of storage as well. And some of that I've had set outside, just, obviously covered up so it doesn't get rained on or anything. And just kind of putting down random props that I think might fit into this sort of industrial area. I also decided to just switch it up a little bit and have a story going on here where there was an accident between two cars here. And I don't think I've used that broken glass decal yet in the city. That would represent, their headlights blowing out and scattering all over the concrete there. And then there's a little police car nearby securing the situation. Now, as for the remaining details here, I added a little partition to the parking lot because I thought that it was a little bit exposed here. So you'd want to keep the parked cars separate from all the ones that were driving around and carrying equipment and stuff. Just using a basic prefab house concrete wall here. That's just a great, very flexible asset to use in this kind of situation. I also added this kind of random communications tower. I thought that would just be something that, they'd use to communicate with all the ships that were coming in. I don't really know how that works, so I'm just making it up as I go. Also changed the surface a little bit with that asphalt paneling decal because I just think it looks cool. Now I wanted to further differentiate between the two dry docks here by using these puddle decals near the one that's full of water because there's going to be, water splashing in and that kind of stuff. And then the one that has been drained for a while has had time for the water to evaporate and for everything to dry off. So there are these decals that represent that surface that once was wet with all the seawater, and now it's dried and left behind this kind of residue. And then just some normal stain decals in all these areas that are remaining that don't have the puddle decals, don't have the dry decals. Oh, and also a few of these damaged areas. I thought the edges of the piers here might be a little bit more worn down just because they've had to deal with the erosion of all this salt water coming in. So everything's a little more faded, a little more damaged over there. Now you might be wondering, why am I putting down this beautiful airport hangar asset by Ronex? And the answer is I have no idea. I have no idea why it's at a 45-degree angle to the shipyard, but that's how it ended up, and I think it looks kind of cool. As for what this actually is meant to be, I am imagining that this is like a big fabrication area for ship parts, I guess? I don't know. And there's also a little long-term asset storage area so they can keep various boats and stuff. Maybe on the side when they're not working on larger ships, they buy and disassemble older ships, used boats and stuff, and keep them back here. I don't know. Anyway, the point is that it's just an additional area of the dockyard where they do different things. So for these bigger parts that they're fabricating here, maybe they would want them to be covered all the time, again, because of the elements. But they also need a really big space to do that for these really big ship parts. And we're going to come back when I take that little trip to the workshop. We're going to come back and put some actual big ship parts in there. So it looks like they're working on something. And so there's actually a reason for this big building to be here. Now, I make the mistake of putting an office building here. It's obviously way, way too close to this gigantic fabrication building. You wouldn't actually be able to wheel these giant pieces out of there without hitting the office building. I didn't really think that through. It looks a little silly, but you know what? I'm going to leave it. It's just one of those weird quirks of Todos Santos that I think fixing it would take away some of the kind of strange character that this city has sometimes. But the building is meant to represent like the administration area and the visitor area. And it's a pretty big operation, pretty valuable operation, so they probably have a lot of employees doing various things in terms of like planning, administration, legal, all the stuff you'd expect from a big, dangerous, expensive operation like this. But it just ended up not being in the perfect place. Although there's this kind of cool little staircase here. I don't know why, but I really like how that bridges the gap between the two elevations. And I'm really just trying to throw last few details down here, fill in some of the blank areas with some grass and trees, and put some wear decals over some of the plainer roads. So at this point, I had a little break from building and took a little traipse over to the Steam workshop, where I decided to look for just a few more interesting props to finish off this build, make it a little bit more realistic, and just overall bring it to life in the way I wanted. I also happened to change some graphic settings while I was at it. Not sure really why I decided to do that in the middle of recording an episode, but here we are. So I was still experimenting with getting the right look while I was doing this build, so I noticed that the footage does look quite a bit darker than it should, so I apologize for that. Hopefully you can still see everything that's going on. Maybe I'll try to come back and lighten it up a little bit, but eventually I think the changes are going to be worth it. They're all going to work out, and overall Todos Santos is going to look a bit more realistic and just a bit more pleasing overall. I don't have a perfect recollection of what changes I made, but I did change a lot of things. If you're interested in learning about graphics, I'll link some references in the description, and hopefully those will be able to help you along in tuning the graphics of your game better than I could trying to explain it. Because I don't really do anything new with the graphics, I mostly just follow in the footsteps of people who are a lot better at that kind of thing than I am. But anyway, check that out in the description if you're interested. And don't hesitate to leave an angry comment if I've forgotten to do that by the time I upload this video. And there's a fairly high chance that'll happen, so yeah, let me know if I have forgotten to do that. Anyway, I felt like I needed a crane asset that was a lot more accurate to what a real-life shipyard crane looks like, and I found that the one that's built into the vanilla cargo port building is actually a really nice-looking crane that fits the bill in this case. There was someone on the workshop who somehow extracted just the crane asset from the cargo port and uploaded that, so I downloaded it and just plopped it down and replaced all the less fitting cranes that I had there. I also, for some reason, struggled with using decals to make the track that the cranes actually run on. I don't know why I didn't just do that with IMT. It's so much easier to do lines of decals like that with IMT. So I really should have done that. But for some reason, I just thought there was like so much going on that it would be hard to do it with IMT for some reason. And of course, ended up doing it the even harder way by manually placing all those. But whatever. It ends up looking fine, so that's all I care about. I also downloaded those rebar assets you saw me just put down, just to make it look like there's a bit more material staged at various places along the shipyard. And I also downloaded these ship piece props. I wanted to give it the feeling that there's something going on down here. This is not meant to be like super detailed and like, the main focus of screenshots or anything. It's just if it happens to be in the background, I wanted it to look like there was ship-related activity going on in the big fabrication building. I thought just having it empty would be kind of pointless. So, yeah. And then, of course, there would be a lot of people that would have to travel here. There would be a lot of jobs provided by this business here and just other things that we're going to add in this area. So I wanted to extend the port bus line that goes mostly east to west and add a couple of stops along the road there. One more asset that I downloaded are these cool little truck cabs that are just meant for driving trailers around the port. At least I'm pretty sure that's what they're for. But I just thought they looked pretty cute, so I put these down all over the port. Just spreading them out in various places, treating them kind of like the empty trailers. You're never going to know like when you're going to need one of these, how often you're going to need them. So they're just everywhere. And then if you'll remember really quickly back to the port build in episode 44, we had the import area, which is the main part of the port, and then the export area. Now I wanted to extend the export area to cover all this space in between the port build and the dockyard build. And again, just following the theme of having it taper off in terms of activity as we get to the edge of the port. All right, that's it for the Dockyard build. Now we're going to continue on and detail that interchange that I adjusted at the beginning of the episode. Now I know it's not exactly related to the Dockyard, but I thought this was a perfect place to include this build because it's right next to the Dockyard, and just the way all this infrastructure works together at the edge of the industrial area, I'm just really happy with it, and I just think the two builds complement each other very well. Now the way you make interchanges in this game, like grade separated interchanges like this, it generally, you'll use the elevated version of a network, and that just makes it look like the entire interchange is just raised up onto pillars, which works in some cases, like if you're making a big stack interchange. But I found that in my time zooming around on Google Maps, and in San Juan in particular as well, they really tried to minimize the use of that kind of road infrastructure, and they'll use retaining walls, they'll use big mounds of dirt, or basically whatever you can do that's less expensive in order to raise up these interchanges and separate the grades. So I really wanted to go in with that kind of build in mind and just fit this thing into the landscape and make it feel a little bit more natural. Like maybe, for example, they selected this area to build this interchange in the first place because there was an elevation change or a hill or something that allowed them to do this kind of build with the least amount of money, the least amount of raised, elevated portions. So it's a little tedious and repetitive, but I did want to show a good chunk of this build because I'm really happy with how it comes out. And I primarily do all this by using these amazing grass retaining walls. I just love these assets. And I don't feel need to have everything line up perfectly. Sometimes you get ugly gaps like this, and I just cover it up with trees. And that way people actually won't be able to tell that the gap is even there in the first place, unless you're actually watching the person build it. But anyway, I think you can really see this kind of theory come together right here when I have this little sunken fly under ramp. I don't know what you'd call it, but I'm going to call it that. And I just think the way the freeway kind of like emerges out of this sunken retaining wall area, I just think that looks so cool. And that's exactly what I was going for. So we're going to take that and bring it all the way across the entire interchange, which is quite a feat because there are lots of different sweeping ramps, on-ramps, off-ramps, all kinds of weird stuff working together in unnatural angles. And we have to take all of that and manually do this process over and over again. But honestly, this is the kind of stuff I love doing in this game, so it's not a big deal. And you could probably get creative with intersection marking tool and do this, like using the retaining walls as decorative network lines. It might actually be more fiddly to do that way. I don't know. And as I go through, I also add some sound barriers along the more residential side of the interchange. Eventually there's going to be a residential area here, and then just some normal crash barriers along other parts of the freeway. So there's almost like a secondary interchange, which is primarily for serving the surface roads. One thing I wanted to do is get a nice gentle slope where the freeway network goes up to cross the tunnel and then comes back down to the normal ground level. And I'll get back to that in a second, but first I just wanted to point out that we get this kind of interesting difference between the two levels of freeway, which I think looks really cool. It looks a little weird with the ugly cliff texture sticking out. So of course we have to come in and give it the same retaining wall treatment. Anyway, to get that more gentle slope that I was talking about, I used node controller and just put down nodes where I thought we'd want to get the curve in the road, and then just adjusted the slope value until I got a nice gentle curve that looks a little bit more realistic than what you get when you just draw the networks out in the first place. Maybe this masterpiece of Microsoft Paint art explains the concept I'm talking about a little bit better. I just like the way the slopes look more natural and more gradual. But hopefully it makes sense what I did. If not, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll build another interchange somewhere else in the city, and I'll make a short video where I just do it all live and explain like my thought process and the techniques I use to get that. If that's something you're interested in, do let me know, and I'll consider doing that when I have some time. Unless you absolutely hate the way this interchange looks, and you don't want to see me explain in more detail how I made it, that's fine. I mean, you can let me know, but I'll still probably make the video at some point. Anyway, we're jumping in here, and I wanted to represent there being a bridge over this tunnel. I mean, technically it's a tunnel, so you don't need a bridge, but I wanted it to look as if they've made a bridge. And frankly, I don't know why I did it this way, but I think it looks kind of cool. So I just use a different material. I'm using the dock surface from the Docks pack by Ronix. because I think they have a nice kind of asphalt look, I guess. The sorts of, I don't know what you call them, like panels that they lay across pillars to make a bridge. I really don't know what I'm talking about, but hopefully you get what I mean. It's just a different material that they use for bridges and overpasses and that kind of thing. So I wanted to represent that there. And then we also have a causeway for the metro line that goes by here with some, I'm not sure what the term is, but these rocks that are laid along the side just as supports, I guess. I don't know. I think it looks kind of nice. And some more grass and trees just to make it look a little bit more detailed. This metro is going to run quite a ways along the highway here, and then it's going to curve off somewhere, probably around the next interchange. We'll curve it off and send it back north. The metro that it's based off of in San Juan has kind of a similar, almost like a C shape. So we'll do something like that. Previously on the series, I've expressed concern about my problem with putting too many trees, and you might have thought that I was joking. I wasn't. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Todos Santos. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you enjoyed it. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.